The pre-dawn silence along the Rapido River valley shatters at precisely 0547 hours on January 22, 1944. For the German soldiers of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, huddled in their reinforced positions overlooking the frozen Italian countryside, the next 60 seconds will rewrite everything they understand about artillery warfare. In that single minute, 456 American artillery shells, fired from dozens of guns scattered across miles of terrain, will arrive simultaneously on their coordinates. Not in a rolling barrage. Not in sequential waves. But all at once, in a mathematically choreographed apocalypse that leaves no time to take cover, no opportunity to react, no chance to survive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is Time on Target. And the men who experience it for the first time don't live long enough to understand what killed them. But how did American forces develop a firing technique so devastating that it would fundamentally alter the calculus of modern warfare? How did a mathematical concept born in the classrooms of Fort Sill, Oklahoma transform into the most feared artillery tactic of World War II? The answer begins not with a weapon, but with a problem that had plagued artillery commanders since the invention of the cannon itself. In the autumn of 1940, while Europe burned and America watched from across the Atlantic, a young artillery officer named Captain Howard McNair sat in a cramped office at Fort Sill's Field Artillery School, wrestling with a problem that kept him awake at night. McNair wasn't a typical officer. He had studied mathematics at MIT before the war, and his mind worked in equations and trajectories rather than parade ground formations. The problem was simple to state but devilishly complex to solve. When an artillery battery fired at an enemy position, the first shell served as a warning siren. Enemy soldiers heard the distinctive whistle of the incoming round, felt the ground shake from the initial impact, and immediately dove for cover. By the time the second, third, and fourth shells arrived, even if fired in rapid succession, the enemy was already protected in bunkers, trenches, and dugouts. Artillery was loud, expensive, and increasingly ineffective at actually killing enemy soldiers who had even a few seconds of warning. McNair had seen the statistics from the Great War, and they were damning. Millions of artillery shells fired. Millions of tons of explosives delivered. Yet infantry assaults still bogged down against enemies who simply waited out the bombardment in underground shelters, then emerged to man their machine guns the moment the barrage lifted. The artillery's thunder announced its own impotence. What if, McNair wrote in his notebook one October evening, we could make all the shells arrive at exactly the same moment? It was a question that seemed to violate the basic principles of sequential fire. Artillery pieces fired one after another. That was simply how it worked. The gun crews needed time to load, aim, and fire. The guns themselves were positioned at different distances from the target. Some were close, some far away. The mathematics of making distant guns and nearby guns land their shells simultaneously seemed impossible. But McNair wasn't thinking about changing the guns. He was thinking about changing time itself, or at least, how artillery batteries perceived and calculated it. What if you could work backwards from the moment of impact? What if, instead of firing as fast as possible, each gun fired at precisely the right moment so that all their shells arrived together? The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but the execution required mathematical precision that had never been attempted in the chaos of combat. Every gun would need to calculate not just the range and angle to the target, but also the precise flight time of their specific projectile. Then, working backward from a predetermined moment of impact, each gun would fire at different times. The closest guns would fire last. The most distant guns would fire first. And if the mathematics were perfect, every shell would arrive in the same 60-second window. McNair called it time-on-target fire. His fellow officers called it impossible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The challenge of convincing the United States Army Field Artillery to adopt a completely new firing doctrine was perhaps more daunting than solving the mathematical problem itself. In 1940, American artillery doctrine was still heavily influenced by French methods from World War I. Fire missions were conducted in a specific sequence, ranging shots to find the target, adjustment rounds to correct aim, and then fire for effect once accuracy was confirmed. It was methodical, predictable, and gave the enemy plenty of warning. When McNair presented his time-on-target concept to a gathering of senior artillery officers at Fort Sill in December 1940, the response was decidedly mixed. Colonel Ernest Harmon, a veteran of the Western Front, listened to the presentation and then asked the question that was on everyone's mind, "Captain, this is fascinating mathematics. But can your system work when radio communications are jammed, when forward observers are under fire, and when gun crews are exhausted after 3 days of continuous bombardment?" It was a fair question. McNair's system required something that had never existed before in artillery warfare: a network of precise timekeeping devices, reliable communication between all firing batteries, and instantaneous mathematical calculations that could be performed under combat conditions. In 1940, most artillery units still relied on field telephones connected by wires that were constantly cut by enemy fire. Many gun crews didn't even have synchronized watches. But McNair had an ally he didn't know about yet. Lieutenant David Parker, an artillery officer stationed with the 1st Infantry Division, had independently begun experimenting with similar concepts during training exercises in Georgia. Parker's approach was slightly different. He focused on the practical mechanics of crew coordination rather than the pure mathematics, but he had reached the same conclusion: simultaneous impact was the future of artillery effectiveness. When Parker and McNair finally met at a field artillery conference in March 1941, their collaboration began to transform time on target from a theoretical concept into a practical doctrine. Parker brought real-world experience from the gun line. He understood crew fatigue, communication breakdowns, and the thousand small inefficiencies that plagued artillery operations. McNair brought mathematical rigor in the theoretical framework. Together, they began developing the actual procedures that would make time on target possible. They created standardized firing tables that incorporated flight time calculations. They developed a communication protocol where a fire direction center could coordinate multiple batteries across a wide area. Most importantly, they designed a system simple enough that exhausted soldiers could execute it in the middle of a battle. The system worked like this: a forward observer would identify a target and call for fire. The fire direction center would calculate the precise moment of impact, say, 0547 and 30 seconds. Then, working backward, they would calculate when each gun should fire based on its distance from the target and the flight time of its shells. The FDC would then transmit firing orders to each battery. Battery A, fire at 0546:15. Battery B, fire at 0546:42. Battery C, fire at 0547:10. When executed correctly, all the shells would arrive within a 60-second window. But could it actually work outside of a training range? The United States Army was about to find out, because in December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and America was suddenly at war. The transition from peacetime experimentation to wartime implementation happened with shocking speed. By February 1942, McNair and Parker's work had been incorporated into updated field artillery training manuals. Every artillery officer being trained at Fort Sill now learned time-on-target procedures. But learning a technique in Oklahoma and executing it under fire were two entirely different challenges. The first test came not in Europe, but in North Africa. In November 1942, as part of Operation Torch, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, beginning their first major ground combat against Axis forces. The artillery units that came ashore included officers trained in the new time-on-target doctrine, but many senior commanders remained skeptical. Major Samuel Hogan, commanding the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion attached to the 1st Armored Division, was one of the early converts. During the opening phases of the Tunisia campaign in early 1943, Hogan's battalion was supporting an infantry assault against a German position near the Kasserine Pass. The initial bombardment had been conducted using traditional methods, sequential fire that gave the Germans plenty of warning. The infantry assault stalled in the face of withering machine gun fire from soldiers who had simply waited out the barrage in their bunkers. Hogan made a decision that would reverberate through the entire American Artillery Corps. For the second assault, he would use time on target. He coordinated with 2 other artillery battalions in the area, calculated the firing times, and at precisely 1,430 hours, over 150 shells landed simultaneously on the German position. The effect was catastrophic. German soldiers, who had been manning their machine guns and preparing for another American assault, were caught completely exposed. There was no warning whistle, no first impact to signal incoming fire. Just sudden, overwhelming destruction. When the American infantry advanced 15 minutes later, they found the German position devastated. Bodies lay in the open, caught in the act of manning weapons or moving between positions. Survivors emerged from bunkers in shock, many with ruptured eardrums and psychological trauma from an experience they couldn't comprehend. One captured German officer, when interrogated, kept repeating the same phrase, "It all came at once." How did it all come at once? Word of Hogan's success spread rapidly through the American artillery community in North Africa. Other commanders began requesting information about time-on-target procedures. The Field Artillery School began receiving reports from the front, and McNair, now a lieutenant colonel, was dispatched to North Africa to observe and refine the technique based on combat experience. What he found was that the theoretical system worked even better in practice than in theory, but it required one critical element that hadn't been fully appreciated during peacetime development: trust. Time on target required battery commanders to give up a degree of autonomy. They couldn't simply fire when ready, they had to fire when ordered, even if it felt counterintuitive. A gun crew positioned close to the target had to wait, holding their fire, while distant batteries fired first. It went against every instinct of artillerymen who were trained to deliver fire as quickly as possible. But the results were undeniable. By the summer of 1943, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily, time on target had become standard doctrine. Artillery units practiced the technique relentlessly. Fire direction centers were equipped with better communication equipment and more precise chronometers. The mathematics were refined to account for different types of ammunition, weather conditions, and terrain variations. The stage was set for the technique's most devastating demonstration. And the venue would be the mountains of Italy, where German forces had constructed defensive positions they believed were impregnable. By January 1944, the Italian campaign had become a grinding war of attrition that tested every assumption about modern warfare. The Germans, under the brilliant defensive mind of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had transformed the Italian peninsula into a fortress. The centerpiece of this defensive system was the Gustav Line, a 100-mile barrier of bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions anchored on the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino. For the Allied forces, breaking through the Gustav Line meant crossing the Rapido River, a deceptively small waterway that German engineers had transformed into a killing ground. They had demolished bridges, mined both banks, and positioned interlocking fields of fire that could shred any crossing attempt. German artillery observers, positioned in the mountains above, could see every approach and call down devastating fire on any Allied movement. The American 36th Infantry Division drew the unenviable task of forcing a crossing. Their commander, Major General Fred Walker, knew his men were walking into a nightmare. Previous attempts by other units had failed catastrophically, with entire battalions cut to pieces in the icy waters. Walker needed an advantage, something that could neutralize the German artillery observers and eliminate the defensive positions before his infantry even reached the river. Enter Colonel Charles Hudis, the division's artillery commander. Hudis had studied every after-action report from North Africa and Sicily. He had personally interviewed Major Hogan about the Kasserine Pass success. And he had become a true believer in time-on-target fire. But what Hudis planned for the Rapido crossing would be the most ambitious TOT barrage ever attempted, coordinating not 3 or 4 battalions, but 16 separate artillery units firing over 450 guns. The planning took 3 weeks. Every German position identified by aerial reconnaissance, every suspected observation post, every approach to the river was assigned target numbers. Fire direction centers worked around the clock calculating flight times, coordinating firing sequences, and rehearsing communication protocols. The choreography was staggering. Guns ranging from 105mm howitzers to massive 155mm long toms would all need to harmonize their fire. The German defenders had no idea what was coming. They had grown accustomed to Allied artillery patterns, the ranging shots, the adjustment fire, the predictable crescendo of bombardment followed by infantry assault. Their defensive doctrine assumed they would have warning. Their survival depended on it. At precisely 0547 hours on January 22, 1944, mathematics became murder. Sergeant Klaus Weber of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division was standing outside his bunker near the Rapido, sharing a cigarette with two other soldiers and discussing the frozen breakfast rations they'd choked down an hour earlier. The morning was crystalline and cold, the kind of winter dawn where sound carried for miles. They should have heard the guns. They heard nothing until the world exploded. The first indication wasn't sound, it was pressure. A wall of displaced air that hit like a physical blow, followed instantaneously by the overlapping cacophony of 456 artillery shells detonating within a 60-second window. There was no crescendo, no warning whistle, no first impact to signal danger. Just immediate, total chaos. Weber never made it to his bunker. None of them did. The mathematical precision of time on target meant that soldiers caught in the open had zero reaction time. One moment they existed, the next they were erased by a statistical probability that had collapsed into certainty. For the soldiers who survived those first 60 seconds, those fortunate enough to already be inside reinforced positions, the experience was psychologically shattering. Corporal Friedrich Hoffmann, sheltering in a concrete bunker, later described it to American interrogators. "We thought it was the end of the world. Not shells falling, the sky itself was collapsing. You couldn't distinguish individual explosions. It was one continuous roar, like standing inside a waterfall made of thunder." The German officers tried to respond, but response required understanding, and understanding required time. Artillery doctrine assumed a pattern. First rounds would hit, forward observers would call corrections, then the main barrage would follow. That gap, usually several minutes, was when you moved reserves, called for counter-battery fire, or repositioned forces. Time on target eliminated that gap. By the time German officers realized they were under bombardment, the bombardment was already over. And in the smoking craterscape that remained, American infantry was already crossing the Rapido. The Rapido River crossing succeeded, though at horrific cost to the infantry. But the artillery performance was flawless. Post-battle reconnaissance estimated that 70% of the German defensive positions in the impact zone were destroyed or abandoned. More significantly, the German reinforcement schedules were completely disrupted because commanders couldn't determine when the bombardment had actually begun or ended. Captain Heinrich Bull, a German artillery officer who survived the Rapido engagement, wrote in his diary, "The Americans have changed something fundamental. Our entire defensive doctrine assumes we will hear them preparing to fire. What do you do against an enemy who can strike everywhere at once with no warning? How do you train soldiers to take cover when there is no sound of incoming fire?" Word of the new American artillery tactics spread rapidly through German intelligence channels. By March 1944, Wehrmacht defensive manuals were being updated with new sections on simultaneous impact bombardment. German officers were instructed to maintain constant cover discipline, never assume they would receive warning before American artillery strikes, and prepare for the psychological impact of bombardment without warning. But understanding a threat and countering it are different challenges. The Germans had no technological answer to time on target. Their artillery doctrine was still rooted in World War I methodologies, decentralized batteries firing independently, with minimal coordination. Creating the kind of synchronized, mathematically precise fire that TOT required would mean completely restructuring their artillery command system. By 1944, Germany lacked the resources, time, and training capacity to implement such fundamental changes. The Americans, meanwhile, were perfecting the technique with every engagement. Artillery officers competed to execute faster TOT calculations. Fire direction centers developed shortcuts and refinements. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, time on target wasn't an experimental tactic, it was standard operating procedure. During the breakout from Normandy in July, entire German panzer counterattacks were shattered by TOT barrages that caught armored columns on roads with no warning. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery stopped German advances not through sustained bombardment but through precisely timed simultaneous impacts that created impassable zones of destruction. Yet for all the mathematical elegance and tactical superiority of time-on-target fire, its true impact was psychological. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, who served with the 2nd Armored Division's artillery through France and Germany, reflected on this years after the war. We weren't just destroying enemy positions, we were destroying their sense of security. Every German soldier knew that at any moment, with absolutely no warning, the sky could fall on them. That kind of stress breaks men faster than bullets. German prisoners of war consistently rated American artillery as their most feared weapon, more than tanks, more than aircraft, more than infantry assaults. The technical term time on target rarely appeared in these testimonies. Instead, captured soldiers described the silent death, thunder from nowhere, or simply the moment everything explodes. The technique also changed American infantry tactics. Knowing that artillery could strike so precisely and with such devastating surprise effect, American commanders became more aggressive. Infantry units would advance closer to their own artillery targets, confident that the sudden onset of bombardment would prevent effective enemy response. The coordination between artillery and infantry, always important, became even more intimate and deadly. By April 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, time on target had become so routine that younger artillery officers couldn't imagine any other way to conduct fire missions. The technique that McNair and Parker had pioneered just 5 years earlier was now simply how artillery works. When the war ended in May 1945, the United States Army conducted extensive analysis of artillery effectiveness. The statistics were striking. Time-on-target barrages achieved casualty rates 3 to 4 times higher than traditional sequential bombardment, while using the same amount of ammunition. The difference wasn't the shells, it was the time. McNair, who ended the war as a full colonel with a Distinguished Service Cross, returned to Fort Sill to head the Field Artillery School. His first act was to ensure that time on target wasn't just doctrine, it was the foundation of all artillery education. Every artillery officer would learn the mathematics, understand the coordination requirements, and drill the procedures until they became instinctive. The technique's influence extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, American artillery used TOT to stop Chinese human wave attacks. In Vietnam, fire bases relied on TOT defensive fires. Even in modern warfare, with GPS-guided munitions and digital fire control systems, the principle remains unchanged: simultaneous impact eliminates reaction time and maximizes effectiveness. But perhaps the most profound legacy is philosophical. Time on target represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, from firepower as brute force to firepower as precise instrument. It demonstrated that warfare wasn't just about courage or resources, but about systems thinking and mathematical precision. A relatively small innovation in timing and coordination had multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapons by an order of magnitude. The German soldiers who survived encounters with time-on-target fire carried psychological scars for decades. In post-war interviews, many described a specific kind of helplessness, the knowledge that death could arrive with absolutely no warning, no chance to react, no opportunity for courage or skill to make a difference. It was warfare reduced to pure mathematics, and they were simply variables in an equation. Standing on the banks of the Rapido River today, you can still see the scarred landscape where the Gustav Line once stood. The bunkers are ruins now, silent monuments to a defensive doctrine that became obsolete in 60 seconds on a January morning in 1944. The river still flows, cold and clear, indifferent to the mathematical revolution that unfolded on its banks. Time on target didn't just change how artillery operated, it changed what artillery meant. It transformed guns from instruments of sustained bombardment into weapons of surgical precision. And it proved that in modern warfare, the side that masters time itself holds an advantage more decisive than any number of guns or shells. The thunder still comes, but now it comes all at once, with no warning, no mercy, and no escape. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.